The church was a flawless white box holding its breath, lilies drifting their heady scent through the stillness like ghosts, the organ humming a fragile line that trembled and went thin as if even it began to doubt, and Eliza Hart stood beneath a wash of late morning light that cut down through the high stained glass windows and scattered sapphires and rubies across her skin, hands clasped around a bouquet that felt heavier than it should have, spine straight, dress fitted like a promise, veil lifting when the old air conditioner shivered, and time, at first, was gentle, rolling forward in soft increments, as if it might still carry her where she'd meant to go. She looked at Graham Pruitt, his mouth in its practiced charming line, his eyes elsewhere for a moment glancing toward one of his groomsmen, toward the priest, toward the front pew where her mother Ruth's fingers worried the pearl clasp on her bag. Her father Frank cleared his throat, her sister's eyes darted like birds, and then he was gone, a step backward that looked like a breath, and another that looked like a joke, and then the hush changed timbre and shifted itself and a murmur pressed in like mist, and someone said his name too brightly, and someone laughed like a panic response, and the organist pulled her hands off the keys and stared at Eliza with the pity of a stranger, and Eliza thought absurdly about the earrings she'd chosen, whether they were too much, whether she should smile so the photographs wouldn't look haunted later, and then the minutes widened like a gash and the priest, a kind man who'd known her since she was a child, touched her wrist and asked if she wanted a glass of water, and her body was two people, one rooted and shining and good, the bride who had done all the right things, sent notes, ironed table place cards, listened graciously when Graham's mother wanted to add another speech, and the other person was weightless and not there at all, a ghost in satin, until she saw him in the back, standing, framed by the pale doors like an idea that had taken shape, a tall man in a cobalt suit that caught what little light there was and made a halo of it, the blue, not the friendly sky kind but the blue of deep seas and city nights and sapphires, his posture unassuming in a way that told her he had practiced disappearing, head slightly bowed as if he were no one, but when he lifted his face she saw eyes like winter sea glass, gray-blue, alert, and gentle, and he didn't look away as everyone else looked everywhere but at her. He moved before she understood she'd want him to, cutting through pews and whispers, through the scent of lilies and perfume and tears, and stopped at a distance respectful enough to honor a ritual he was interrupting, and his voice, when it reached her, was smoke-soft but clean, like the first breath you take after a storm. "Eliza," he said, and it was not a question, it was not the way friends said your name in a disaster, it was the way a doctor says it when there are things you must hear. "This isn't your failure," and she felt the world tilt back toward her with that sentence, as if the room itself had exhaled, and then he offered his hand, not with the flair of rescue but the steadiness of a person who had once been the one drowning, and somewhere outside the church doors the press was inexplicably present, drawn by rumor and the scent of spectacle, their lenses like glittering insects, and she could feel that hunger. "Coming, walk with me," he said gently, and she stared at the white ribbon around her bouquet until it blurred, then at his hand, the knuckles scarred faintly as if he'd learned things the hard way, and thought of herself as a girl on a high diving board looking down at summer water, and thought of Ruth's face in the front pew, the way grief could calcify and make a person small and mean and careful forever, and of Graham's easy smile and the way he had started to say we would do this and we would do that, and what did she think of living further uptown and losing the art studio because it wasn't practical after they had kids, and of the way he had touched her as if she were a thing he had purchased at considerable price and wanted to keep safe from scuffs and scrapes and other people's fingerprints, and she said, yes, when she didn't know what she was agreeing to, and the stranger in blue did not look triumphant or pitying or anything but present, and then they were moving, past the priest who squeezed her shoulder as if to say, "Go, I am not offended by mercy," past her mother whose mouth opened and closed around words she couldn't find, past the groomsman who started to step forward and then thought better of it, out through a side door dipped in shadow that smelled of lemon cleaner and old wood, down a narrow stone stair that seemed meant for servants and secrets, and her heels clattered and she clenched her bouquet and the veil tried to fly away and he put a hand out without looking and caught the fine netting as if he had been born to catch things that could shatter, and then they were in the alley, and the day hit them like applause, light and heat and sirens a long way off, a delivery man staring, a stray cat flattening itself under a dumpster, and his car she did not notice until later that it was not one you saw often, a vintage Aston Martin in the same deep blue as his suit, impossibly elegant and out of place amid garbage cans and graffiti, the kind of car a person could write a life into, purred at the curb, and a driver in a cap opened the door and didn't look at her at all, which was the first gift of the day. She got in and the leather smelled of cedar and something clean, and the window tint turned the world into a place she could almost endure, and her bouquet slid out of her hands and landed on the seat, droplets of water shaking from the stems like a small rain, and the stranger sat beside her leaving a respectful space and the door clicked and the driver, square-shouldered, older, with a name she would later learn was Owen, pulled slowly out into traffic as if nothing extraordinary was happening, as if they were not leaving the end of one life behind them and entering something that didn't yet have a name. "Do you want to tell me where to take you?" he said after a stretch of silence in which the only sound was the city's rough music and her pulse in her ears and the engines idle like a cat's breath, "or would you like the ocean?" And that last word landed somewhere in her chest that had been locked and airless since she was a child and sat under a pier with her knees in the cold sand, listening to her father talk about tides and time and how, if you let it, the water would teach you everything you needed to know about leaving and returning, and she swallowed and said, "Ocean," because it was not the kind of day for the careful answer, and he nodded once as if that had been the only correct response, and gave a small motion with his hand that meant everything to Owen, who changed lanes and made decisions and began to string together the kind of route only men who had been chased knew how to find. In the back seat Eliza peeled off her veil and draped it across her lap like a lost weather system, and the stranger offered her his jacket without assuming she'd take it, and she did, the lining cool against her bare shoulders, and she was suddenly aware of being a person in a room with a man, aware of danger and grace and the way the body remembers things before the mind does, but he had turned his face to the window, giving her privacy inside his presence, and that unexpected decency undid her more than any other kindness would have, so when she laughed it sounded like a crack in ice and she clapped a hand over her mouth and shook, and the tears she had been saving for a respectable place came like summer rain, sudden and abundant, and he did not say it would be okay, did not move to touch her, did not make a show of looking away, simply sat there and let the silence hold her as if it were a bowl, and by the time they hit the bridge the organ music in her head had stopped and the lilies had died and the church might have been a story she had once heard about a girl and a mistake. They went where she said ocean and he translated it into Montauk in his head, into dunes and old cedar and the long slow horizontal of salt and light and breath, but first there was a stop, not because they needed anything but because encountering the ordinary after a rupture is how you make the world real again, and at a roadside diner with a neon sign missing its N, a waitress with a braid like a rope and a lipstick color that matched the pie special did not blink at the sight of a bedraggled bride and a man in a $5,000 suit on a Tuesday afternoon. She just plunked down 2 mugs of coffee and asked sugar and milk, and Eliza's hands remembered how to stir, how to lift, how to sip, and the coffee hit her veins like a small miracle, and the stranger smiled not with his mouth exactly but with his eyes crinkling at the corners, the way someone does when they are relieved to see you do something human, and she realized she didn't know his name. "I'm Eliza," she said, because knowing a person's name felt like the smallest amount of control she could reclaim, and he nodded. "Cashin," he said, and the syllables were strange and old world and fitted him in a way that made sudden sense. Cashin Vale, he added after a breath, as if to own the thing fully and not make it a guessing game or a power move, and the name crossed the room and made the waitress straighten up, made someone at the counter glance over and then away as if they had to be respectful of the gravity of certain names, and Eliza saw the recognition pass through the room like a mild electric current. Vale, of Vale Industries, the man whose face was on the cover of magazines when reporters wanted to write about old money gone new, a portfolio that included everything from sustainable energy startups to a streaming service to a line of luxury hotels that people said felt like a religion, and she looked at him again not because he was a billionaire but because now she had to shift the scale in which she held him, had to balance the fact of his immense resources against the softness with which he had said her name, against the way his hand had hovered near the veil. "I'm not kidnapping you," he said, "right," and she snorted into her coffee, the sound unglamorous and entirely hers. "If you wanted to be, Owen would have made it much tidier," and Owen, the driver, who had repaired to the counter for a grilled cheese, half smiled and lifted a brow, and the three of them existed in a small circle of safety that made it possible to breathe. By the time they reached the coast the light had gone thin and delicious, the blue of the stranger's suit matched by the blue of the sea, the blue of the clouds when weather can't decide which way to go, and she stood on the empty stretch of sand with her shoes in her hand and the hem of her dress streaked with dirt and leaves from the church grounds and city grime from the alley and diner grease, and none of it mattered. The ocean laid itself out like a ribbon you could walk to the end of if you had time and a disregard for limits, and the wind caught her hair and she realized she was cold in a way that made her feel alive, and Cashin stood a small distance away with his hands in his pockets like a boy, the slipstream of money and myths loosing off him in the face of this older, truer thing, and she said, "I thought I was going to marry him," and it wasn't a plea and it wasn't a question, it felt like a compromise, he said gently, and the wind whipped his words to her a second after he said them, and she wanted to be angry at him for naming something she hadn't confessed to herself but she felt only extraordinary relief. "I would have made him happy," she said, "he would have been very proud to have made me into exactly what he wanted, and then we would have grown old and I would have called that contentment," and Cashin was quiet a long time, and when he spoke it was not in the tone of a judge. "Sometimes a life can be a soft cage," he said, and he walked closer. Then and held out his hand and she put the ring in it. She had forgotten it was on her finger, the thing heavy and glittering and expensive in the way that made some people think it could hold a life together by force, and he didn't throw it into the ocean like a movie would have required. He turned it in his palm, and for a moment it caught the last of the light and fired it out in a brilliant arc toward nothing, and then he closed his fist around it and put it back in her hand. "You get to decide what to do with that when you're not bleeding," he said simply, and she wanted to thank him for always choosing the human thing over the cinematic gesture, but instead she said, "Why were you there?" And this time his pause was long and thoughtful, and when he answered he chose the truth that would not burn them both. "Because I had business with him," Cashin said, and the word business sounded like a room with no windows, "and because it turned out that business would have ruined you if it ran on unchallenged, and I could do something about it," and she looked down at the sand that soughed around her ankles with every incoming wave and out, at the horizon that was line and mystery, and she did not press, because she recognized a boundary when a man drew one with care. He did not take her to a hotel that evening because hotels, even the most beautiful, were made of other people's wishes and decisions, of linen touched by other sleeping hands. Even the most private suite had a ghost of room service, so he drove her, after a long stretch of nothing that felt like the exact medicine her body required, down a road that unspooled into an older place, cedar shingles weathered to silver, glass that let the ocean speak in, a house that had once belonged to someone. who loved making things with their hands and now belonged to him and to the salt and the moon. He did not bring her in through the front door as if she were expected, he brought her around the side to a deck where a blanket watched the sea on a chair, and a steaming mug waited where the kettle had not recently boiled, and the place felt less like a billionaire's lair than a retreat for a person who had learned the hard way that he needed quiet to survive, and he said, "You can stay here as long as you like," and he took a step back as if to demonstrate that stay did not include him unless invited, and she wanted to ask about the business with Graham, about the secret. She could feel like a slow bruise under his calm, but instead she said, "Thank you," because the words were heavy and important and loaded with everything the day had required of both of them, and he smiled in that way again with the eyes and the lines around his mouth, a little astonished that he had been permitted to help. He left her his jacket like a talisman, and sleep came down on her at last in a room where the ocean made a sound like someone breathing in a way that soothed you into joining, and in the morning she woke in her body, limbs heavy, mouth dry, heart steady, and she stood at the window and watched a gull wheel and thought of being a person again. They built the next 3 days like a truce between strangers. There were long walks where not much was said and every word mattered. There were meals that he cooked himself with the awkward hands of a man who had taught himself late and gladly failed at perfect. There were visits from Owen appearing and disappearing with quiet competence. There were phone calls on which she pressed decline because she was not yet a person who owed the hungry world anything. There were text messages from Lydia, her best friend, that were both ferocious and tender and ended with "Tell me where you are, I will come," and Eliza sent back a photo of the sea without comment and Lydia sent back 3 hearts and the words "good," and there were voicemails from her mother that started reasonably and sank into weaponized worry, and Eliza ignored them not because she didn't love Ruth but because love didn't require her to answer every time someone else felt frightened. In that soft isolation, truths, like shy animals, ventured out. He told her about Blue Haven, not at once and not with a flourish, but because she found the room by accident one afternoon when she was looking for tea. He had not locked it because he did not bring people here who required locked doors, but she found a space unlike the rest of the house, a war room another man might have used for hostile takeovers, the tables covered in maps and lists and names and phone numbers, Polaroids of apartments and shelters and safe houses, a world built quietly under and around the official one, blue pins in 100 towns, the work of moving women and children from danger to safety done in a network so fragile it looked like a spider web and so strong it held when men tried to ring the world. The blue in the pins called back to his suit, to the car, to the way he held his breath when he looked out at the sea, and she said Blue Haven, reading the letters stenciled on a board near the door, and he said, "We don't call it that" aloud, and the way he said it made the hairs on her arms lift as if the work had energy. "We don't call it anything. It's safer when it doesn't exist," and his face in that space was a different face, stripped of the careful public composure he wore like a beautiful shirt in the other rooms. This was a man who had chosen his life's work knowing that if he got it wrong, others would pay first, a man who had learned to live with that cold fact and let it sharpen him rather than curdle him, and there were too many names for a man who had simply been born rich and bored, and she felt a slow, shining admiration cover her like light. The secret, then, was not that he was good but that he was privately good in ways that made him unpopular in circles that liked their money to stay clean and visible. The secret was also that he was bad at letting anyone inside the rooms where his heart worked itself raw. "I saw your work before I saw you," he said that night, the ocean loud in the dark as if to encourage bravery, "a piece you donated to a community center fundraiser uptown, 2 girls sitting under a railing at the seaside with their knees tucked up, bare feet sandy, one of them looking out and one looking down. The light on their faces was different, like they were in separate weather systems, but the way you put them close said they were still in the same day, in the same life. I wanted to be there with them. I wanted to tell them something. He was not a man who said too much. She understood in that instant that for him talking was either weapon or sacrament, and he chose carefully, and the fact that he reached for her with words meant he had decided she was not an enemy. She told him about the girls in the painting, herself and Maya, the neighbor at the ocean, one August when they were 12, the day the lifeguards pulled a man from the water and covered him and everyone pretended not to look, and he told her that when his sister died, the color he could look at without wanting to die was blue because it was everywhere and it wanted nothing from him, and he had worn blue at first like a shield and then like devotion, and she asked, was your being there at the church because of your Blue Haven work? And he let the long quiet between them breathe before he said, partly, and in the space that word made she understood there were other parts that were about him and his hunger and the way her painting had landed inside him and made a noise that didn't stop, and she didn't chase the rest of the words because a person who hunted a man's secrets would never be loved by him. Instead she told him about the way Graham had been kind and how strange that word becomes when someone uses it like a pillow smothering your breath. On the fourth day, the world having allowed them a reprieve came to collect them with interest. There were photographs of her slipping out of the church with a man in blue. There were headlines that made it a story that was not hers: runaway bride snared by blue billionaire. There were talking heads who had never stood in a ruined life discussing the ethics of rescue. There were op-eds diagnosing her hunger for attention. There were friends of Graham's who said he was saintly in letting her go. And a rumor that she had a cruel temper and a taste for drama that no man could endure. And then there was a threat that did not come via media but through Owen, who brought Cashin a manila folder with a single piece of paper inside, an email chain between Graham Pruitt and a private equity partner that casually discussed leveraging Eliza's father's contracting business as a conduit for funds that did not want to exist in the daylight, the kind of thing you didn't need to be an expert to understand as both illegal and ugly. And the date on the first email was months before he proposed. Eliza sat with the paper in her lap and watched the man she now understood had stood in the back of a church not because he wanted to perform a romantic gesture but because he wanted to be close enough to put his body into a place where danger might arrive and he might be usefully in the way. And she said, "You confronted him," and Cashin nodded. "I told him I had proof and that I would hand it to Ada if he loved you the way he said he did," he said evenly, not proud, not apologetic, a battlefield report, and he ran first down a hallway and then from the life he was about to ruin, and she went to the sink and vomited neatly into it as if her body understood what her mind didn't want to name, and when she rinsed her mouth and came back to the table with the mail of destruction on it she said, "You kept this from me," and he didn't flinch. "It was not mine to give you until you could bear the weight of it," he said, "and I wanted you to leave on your feet, not because I pushed you," and she set the paper down with care and said, "I don't know if I forgive you," and he said, "You don't have to," and that was when she realized he would rather be disliked than pretend he hadn't done what he'd done to keep her safe, and the fact that he did not ask for absolution did not free her from the work of it. She left then because there are times when distance is the only honest answer. She packed the dress he had laundered so it would not remind her of an alley. She left the jacket folded neatly on the chair. She told Owen she could call a car and Owen said, "Please let me do at least one thing today without arguing," and drove her to the city in the Aston without Cashin. She walked into her apartment, the one she had told Graham was too small for two but perfect for her because she could touch any book she needed from the couch, and found a stack of gifts like a shrine to a future, plates nested in tissue, a blender in a box with pictures of smoothies on it, a pile of notes written by women who had chosen to commemorate a social contract, each message now a little piece of glass to hold gingerly. She sat down among them like a woman in a museum of the recent past and took up a pen and wrote a letter. "You did not save me," she wrote to Cashin. "I am not saved. I am choosing to survive, and I am angry that you put your hands on a lever in a room I did not know was connected to mine. But you were right. I would have called it contentment while I withered. I don't know what to do with you. I don't know what to do with the person I am around you. She did not send it. She painted instead, because that was how she had learned to metabolize the indigestible, a canvas the size of a door that she filled with a gradient of blues, not a soft umber but slabs of color fighting for space, a field torn by a bright slash that might have been sea sun or a wound, and when she stepped back hours later with paint under her nails and stiff shoulders it wasn't relief, exactly, but she had made the day into something else. He did not interrupt. She had believed he might, not because he was controlling but because he was a man who had learned that the work got done when he pushed, but he understood the boundaries inside her better than men who had known her longer, and he stayed away and let the press do the ugly dance alone, and he let the men he had scared with his existence as a man who uses his money to dismantle their old ways call in favors, and he went about his other work, and when his board asked whether the optics of Blue Haven were damaging to his brand he said, "We are not a brand, we are a company I own and I will put it anywhere I like, including under a woman who needs it so she does not drown." The next time they saw each other, it was because she called him, an arsonist charged but not convicted in an old case that had touched Blue Haven's edges, had set a small fire at one of the shelters in Queens as a warning. No one hurt because the staff were good and the systems worked, but the children woke to smoke and screamed and Eliza's body reassembled itself around one sharp decision. She called Lydia and asked for the art space at the back of her gallery on the Lower East Side, and by noon had half a dozen volunteers sweeping and mopping and painting according to a plan she invented out of grief and love. 30 hours later there were soft rugs and beanbags and shelves of books and bins of pencils and blocks and a radio turned low, and she called Cashin to say, "Bring them here," and when he arrived with 2 vans of sleepy, bewildered children and women who looked like every kind of woman you'd meet on a train or at the grocery store or hugging themselves on a stoop, and when those people stepped into the room made for them and the worst of the night loosened its grip, he looked at her as if she had reached into him and fixed a thing he had been tightening against all day, and she said, "Don't look at me like I'm a saint," and he smiled like a man newly in love with the fact that persons like her exist. "Oh, I know saints," he said wryly, "they're very tiresome," and together they picked up a bag of donated stuffed animals and started sorting. He told her then, in the quiet deep of that evening, sitting on the curb outside Lydia's gallery with paper cups of lukewarm coffee, about the rest of the secret. When he was 16, a man he admired had put a hand where it didn't belong and told Cashin that his body was the price of access, the price of being made into a person men like that would admit at their tables, and he had left and built his own tables and set his own prices, and he had decided then that his money would not buy him anything he couldn't live with in the morning. There were so many ways to be harmed, he said, and people who have never been harmed think harm always looks like a bruise, but sometimes it looks like a charming smile and a deal that leaves you with nothing of yourself. And she listened, and a soft, fierce rage rose in her that he had learned kindness in the places where other people were broken, and she put her hand on his for the first time and said, "I see you," and he closed his eyes as if the seeing hurt and healed. It should have been the part where the old story releases the new one to go forward, but men like Graham, who were not evil enough to be monsters nor good enough to be saved, are persistent as mold. He went to the press with his own secret version and did the talk show circuit in which he cried and said he hoped Eliza was safe. He forgave her, then said he feared she had been manipulated by a man with unlimited money and perhaps darker motives, and then he sold the story of their love for a number that could cover 3 months' rent in a nice building, and then when even that did not make him feel large, he contacted the men who had lost money when Blue Haven had made a path for a woman out from under them, and the smallest of those men, dangerous because small men with appetites tend to make the biggest messes, came to take out his frustration on the pretty blue machine that Cashin used to move quietly through the world. It happened on a night soft as silk when Eliza and Cashin walked up the steps of a brownstone where a fundraiser for the arts center she had dreamed up in a moment of crisis now existed in plans and budgets and sketchbooks. The Blue Hour, they were calling it for now, a place where children and adults who had come through Blue Haven would make pictures and clay monsters and songs and soup and archive the living when a man in a cheap blue blazer that mocked the older best one put his shoulder to the door at Blue Haven's administrative office across the city and slipped in with a can of accelerant and the determination to leave a mark. A janitor with a cigarette break who was not at his post and therefore saved the world wandered back and smelled what he knew and pulled the alarm, but the kind of person who intends harm often gets at least a little of what he wants, and by the time Cashin and Eliza received the call, by the time they ran there are men who would send others. Cashin's first instinct was always to use the body he had. By the time they arrived the block was awash of red lights and damp air and the building coughed smoke like an old dragon, and a girl, one of the ones who had drawn cats at Lydia's that afternoon and told Eliza she liked to make the sky purple because sometimes the world needed more purple, was missing. Eliza did not think, she went. She ducked under tape and through a door when the firefighter's back was turned because there are things art school does not teach but a lifetime of being a person does. Cashin swore once quietly and followed, because the whole point of making money and building a life out of exile was not to be the sort of man who left a woman to do the hard thing alone. Inside the air was a live thing, hot and mean and making up new rules as it went, and smoke reduced the world to inches. They moved like halves of a single animal, his hand on her shoulder not to steer but to anchor them both, her body pressed to the ground where the air was less cruel, and in a room that had not yet taken to the idea of burning. The girl crouched under a desk with her purple sky drawing in her fist and her mouth open in a silent scream, and Eliza said hey, as if she were entering a kitchen, did you save me some cookies? And the girl blinked and bolted into Eliza's arms, and Cashin took the girl's weight and led, and Eliza kept one hand on a backpack strap so she would not lose both of them to the smoke, and they made a line of motion through an unfriendly place and came out dotted with ash and blinking, and Eliza handed the girl to someone who would be the owner of her future, and Cashin sat down abruptly on the curb and coughed until his lungs remembered how to undo their fear, and when the EMT knelt beside him and said sir, with the tone she reserved for men who thought they were fine, Eliza took his palm and said, for someone who sends money, you sure do love to risk your life, and he wheezed, money's the least interesting thing I own, and she kissed his tacks of smoke from his forehead and thought, mine. The aftermath was messy and public. There were arrests and there were editorials, and every person who had ever loved or hated Cashin Vale felt permitted to write essays about the day the Blue Billionaire went into a burning building, and Eliza held her studio open 24 hours for a week, and people came by with toys and blankets and fridges full of lasagna, and she slept on a couch under a painting she had started and could not yet finish, and when Cashin's board used the event as leverage to pressure him he was becoming too visible for their comfort, he told them he didn't answer to men who had never bothered to set aside their fear, and when Graham sent a single text message, "Are you done playing with fire?" Eliza blocked him and did not write the furious letter she could have written, because letters are gifts and she would not give him even a bittersweet. Forgiveness was not one thing, it was not the movie version in which a woman says, "I forgive you," and a man's eyes fill with tears and everyone can move on. It was a long, unglamorous set of decisions to let the body stop bracing when Cashin came into a room, a choice to let him touch her hair and not flinch at the closeness, to sit with him while he read through a sheaf of numbers, while she mixed ultramarine into cobalt to find the sky she wanted. One morning, months after the church, Ruth stood in Eliza's studio doorway and looked like a woman who had finally run out of ways to weaponize her fear, and she said, without preamble, "I don't know how to love you when your life looks different than the one I practiced loving," and Eliza kissed her mother's forehead and said, "Then let's practice something else," and Ruth did exactly that slowly and badly and heroically, because love is not the domain of the brave or the cowardly but of those willing to be foolish for long enough. And one night, a late one, in the Montauk house where the ocean was always counting, Cashin took her down to the shore and confessed the last of it, the thing he hadn't told because it wasn't noble, because it would muddy the clean lines of the story he preferred about himself, that he had seen her painting at the fundraiser and asked a woman the way men with money ask to know things, and the woman had told him the artist's name, and then later at dinner at the Pruitt's house when he hated the roasted lamb and endured it because he hates waste more, he had seen Eliza across the table and had made the connection and had felt the floor drop in the way it does when your heart and your history agree on something, and he did not believe in fate in the sense of a script you cannot edit, but in the way that certain notes, when struck, continue to vibrate, and he had felt her vibrate inside him and he did not know what to do with that, and so he had done the thing he always did, he had asked for the facts, for the legalities, for who Graham talked to and how often and where the money went, and the facts produced ugliness, and he had done what he does, he had quietly inserted his body into the way, and then when the miracle of the church happened, when Graham ran and Eliza said yes to a hand, he had taken it as a sign not that they were meant to be anything but that he was obliged to behave like the person he liked to think he was, and he had done his best, which had not been good enough to keep her from pain, not good enough to keep him from failing her at least once. "I am sorry," he said simply, and the words did not feel like a sentence but like a hand putting down a heavy thing. "I should have told you sooner. I wanted to be the hero and you deserved a person," and she laughed, softened by love and anger and the prefatory tenderness to both, and said, "You are very bad at being a hero," and he smiled because she had forgiven him without making a noise about it, because she had called him a person, and in his mouth he held it like bread. When the Blue Hour opened that winter, on a day of exhausted light, there were 30 people in the room, and then there were 100, and then there were too many to count, and Noah, the boy who told jokes only his mother understood, cut the ribbon with scissors too big for his hand, and everyone cheered as if he had solved hunger. Eliza stood behind a table covered in jars of markers and bowls of buttons and piles of fabric, and Cashin stood at the edge of the room in a suit a shade darker than the sky, his tie loosened because if he turned into a corporate portrait he would be diminished by it, and he shook hands and said hello and disappeared into corners to pick up paper cups before they spilled, and when a reporter asked him if he was worried that Blue Hour would be controversial, he said, "Everything worth anything is controversial," and when the same reporter asked Eliza if she wasn't worried that her relationship with Cashin complicated things, she said, "My life is complicated by my relationships, like every life," and then she picked up a marker and drew a cat for a girl who wanted a purple sky and a green sun, and the girl laughed like a bell, and the room felt like the inside of a heart beating against the winter. They didn't marry quickly because neither of them needed that for the shape of their love, and they didn't swear to be each other's everything because everything is a word that contains too much and leaves you with a mouthful of cloud, but one evening at Blue Hour, when the world is mostly one color and your eyes adjust and find the rest, they stood at the edge of the water the way her father had taught her to, and he told her the names of the stars he knew because he had taught himself those. Like he had taught himself to cook and to be the sort of man people trusted in fire, and she took his hand and said, "No secrets, no rescues, just arrivals," and he said, "and departures when we need them," because he had learned to leave, and then they walked into the water until it lifted them and she taught him to lay back and float, his hair a dark halo, his eyes open to the fading light, his breath deep, his body trusting something he could not control, and the ocean held them both and whispered the whole old story of what breaks and what mends, and the title of her old life lost its hold, and the man in blue, a stranger once, was not a stranger anymore, and the city and the sea and all the rooms they would ever open together rose ahead like the visible part of a vast, blue secret, their life, unfolding. The organ faltered first, as if a single wavering note could hold back the inevitable, a high tremulous thread that found the rafters and clung there while the gathered bright faces turned toward the back doors and waited for the man who did not come, and Lila Harrow felt her breath snag under the lace of her veil as her mother's fingers tightened on her shoulders from behind, a final maternal brace before the world pitched. Outside the stained glass windows a summer storm mumbled along the Hudson, building heat and thunder in the seams of the city, and inside the old church lilies exhaled their high sweet ache of scent, bridal and funereal in equal measure, while whispers like mouse feet skittered across the pews and the bridesmaids blinked in confusion, and the officiant kind eyes, worn Bible glanced at the discreet watch on his wrist and then at Lila with almost paternal apology, and the quartet in the balcony, advised to pause between movements, sat there, bows down and looked toward the vestibule where a man in a cobalt suit leaned against a column, watching her with an expression so steady and inward it felt like a held breath, a blue flame shielded by a cupped hand. She had been taught how to smile through an ache, to laugh when a thing cut, to hold herself like a vase holds water, and yet in that tilted minute her bones made a sound in her head like breaking ice, something old and private giving way, not just the moment, not just the day, but the quiet vow she'd made as a child that she would never again stand inside a doorway and look out at a disappearing back, that she would never be left waiting like her mother with her apron still on, flower on her cheek, eyes darting to the street for a car that never turned the corner, because fathers did not always stay, and this morning she had fastened joy to her like a brooch and refused to imagine alternate endings, and now the mother's hand slipped from her shoulder when the wedding planner whispered, then the whisper caught like flame, the bridesmaids looked down in abrupt pity, and the officiant stepped forward, gentle voice pitched to sound private in a place that amplified every sound, and said, "He's not coming, Lila," and then whatever thread of music lingered unspooled into the wide dome of that word ruined and the first camera flash popped in a back pew and she felt the heat of humiliation rise like a fever, a red tide under the white, under the lace. Her mother's voice came from a long tunnel, "Baby, baby, look at me," but she could not look at anyone, she could not hold that kind of pity, so she turned toward the vestibule where the stranger in blue had moved, had become a presence almost at her elbow, and he looked at her the way one looks at a skyscraper when a window suddenly shatters, with the startled instinct to shelter anyone below from falling glass, and in that single and lifelong heartbeat he was next to her with an umbrella its folded length, a dark baton in his hand, a conductor for the moment, his voice low and precise, the kind of voice trained not to carry, saying, "Miss Harrow, forgive me, logistics sent me, we should go, right now, there's a press gaggle outside," and she knew nothing of who he was, only that his suit was the kind of blue the river is at 4 in the morning, when even the buildings hush, and the tie was loosened as if he had come from a thing he'd left behind, and that she could not, would not, bleed out in public light, so she nodded like a sleepwalker and let him take her bouquet and hand it off to the nearest cousin who all but dropped it, and then he folded her hand into his and it was not possessive or practiced but urgent and sure, a grip that spoke fluently, "Follow me and we will find you air," and they gossamered down the side aisle in a weird anti-recessional, the long veil trailing like a slow wave, and they slipped through a little side door that the wedding planner had meant for caterers and deliveries, and the corridor there smelled of lemon cleaner and cool stone, and then there was a blade of afternoon outside, heat like a body, a scatter of wet from a rain that had not yet committed, and he guided her with a light pressure around the corner to a waiting car tucked in the shadow of the church, sleek, black, humming, the driver's seat empty, and he opened the passenger door for her as if she'd been getting into cars beside him all her life, as if he could occupy the space between shock and action with such intimacy that it felt familiar, and she slid in and the world came in on her with the roar of the A/C and the slam of the door like a heartbeat thunk, and for a second she only stared at her own white knuckles and the ring that looked like a planet someone else had discovered and placed on her hand, while the stranger in blue came around and took the driver's seat, clicked his seat belt, and glanced at her with a quick, clinical concern as he pulled them into motion, not speed, just smoothness, the car gliding into the stream of city traffic as if the whole thing were choreographed to an inaudible score that only he could hear. Street by street the church fell away, buildings unspooled, sunlight strobed through trees, and Lila pressed the back of her head into the leather seat and tasted metal, adrenaline flooding to the point where tears might come in their own time or not at all, and the stranger reached into the center console without looking and drew out a bottle of cold water and a white handkerchief folded to perfect quarters and placed both on the seat between them as if giving her a choice between solvents ice or cotton, cool or soft, and she said, very quietly because anything louder would break the illusion of control, "Where are you taking me?" And he said, "Somewhere without cameras," which in this city was either a fantasy or a skill, and she stared out at the blur of cement and glass and felt the twine of her chest knot tighter, the helium of the morning gone, the day now dense and full of angles, and she pulled the veil off. It resisted the pins with a little hiss and then gave and set it in her lap like the skin of some creature that had shed, and she could not look at his profile for more than a moment because it was pleasant to look at in the way of statues that have endured rain, some weather in the lines of its square jaw softened by a faint scar that angled from ear to mouth and made an argument for survival, a mouth that did not smile just to reassure, eyes briefly meeting hers at stoplights with a focus that made everything else irrelevant, a focus reserved for crossword clues that mean more than they appear, and she kept thinking, even as her stomach reeled, of how blue is both the color of bruise and sky, grief and ceremony, and that she should say thank you and she could not because her tongue was elsewhere, and he said, without taking his eyes from the long glare of Broadway, "I'm sorry." That was unkind of him, and she almost laughed because the understatement of it cracked something tender and absurd in her chest, and she said, "You have a gift for understatement," and he allowed a corner of his mouth to move, not a smile, almost the first thread of one, and he said, "It sounds better than saying I'd like him to walk into a door." They lifted off the mass of Midtown a little, threaded west, the river opening out ahead like a sheet of tarnished coin, and he took them down under a highway into a little slit of lot beside an old pier where gulls fretted and the water made an unending sound against wood, the world quieter and ambient, as if someone had turned the city down to a murmur, and he killed the engine and said, "You don't owe me conversation," and she nodded because she could not absorb another person's expectation. Not even kindness, not yet. And the quiet around them was not empty but full of the evidence of living boats knocking, a jogger's footfalls on the path, a child asking for a blue popsicle and a father saying he'd only get half, no more sugar, and the thin electric whine of a cicada high in a plane tree, and that human residue did what the car's air could not, it let her breathe, and she cried then, without apology, big graceless tears that smudged the careful work someone else had done on her face, and the stranger did nothing and everything right, looked away out the windshield as if watching a movie he'd seen too many times, a scene where someone loses and finds herself, and he didn't speak or try to touch her or offer a tired platitude, he only let the silence hold the shape of her grief until the shaking settled from thunder to aftershock, and when she finally pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth and swore softly because she had not done that in a church before and felt that even God might forgive an honest word, he reached once more into the console and came up with a little brown packet that looked, improbably, like sugar but was in fact one of those wet cloths airlines give you, and she inhaled at the small kindness, and between wipe and breath work and an accidental pocket of humor when her veil slid off the seat and pooled on the floor like a sleeping cloud, Lila eventually asked, "Who are you, and he said, after a beat that made of his name a gift. Rather than an assumption, Soren, and the name fell into the car with the cadence of northern latitudes and cold water and discipline, and she said, Lila, and he nodded once as if he knew and would put it away somewhere safe, and then they just listened to the river. It should have ended there, the kindness in the small space, but the city is a creature that smells vulnerability, and Soren's phone, he didn't seem like a man who let a phone control him. So when he looked down and his jaw tightened, Lila understood the seriousness, hissed softly with a message and then another, and he glanced at her with regret and the faintest smile of that kind of man who apologizes before he does something necessary, and he said, "Forgive me, I need you off the street." They found us, and when she looked past his shoulder she saw, as if conjured, as if the air had manufactured them, the long lens of a camera rise and nod like a hunting bird from behind a trash can, the sparkle of a distant flash, the curious tilt of strangers' heads, and Soren drew the car into motion with a grace that concealed urgency, turned them around into the shadow of the highway and took them away that felt like a secret, the vehicle sliding into a garage whose door rose like a theater curtain, closed down behind them to reveal a cave of concrete that smelled like rain left in a bottle, and the way he moved then said he had done this before. He did not fumble or hesitate, and he came around to her door and offered his hand only because she had heels that were not meant for escape, and he took her through a corridor that seemed to exist just for people who required invisibility, and into an elevator whose button had no numbers,